Has anyone ever seen this show? That question eventually became an obsession. I started asking old friends, family members, even strangers online. I made posts on Reddit and obscure message boards, describing what I remembered and hoping someone, anyone, would recognize it. No one ever did. The memory itself feels smudged around the edges, like an old photograph that's been handled too many times. What I remember most clearly is sitting in a dim room, the glow of a box television flickering against the walls. I remember watching a children's show. The characters were puppets. The boy wore a striped shirt beneath patchwork overalls, stitched together from mismatched fabrics. The girl wore a bright yellow dress with a stiff white collar. Their eyes were enormous and completely black. Not shiny plastic eyes like most puppets have, just flat, dark circles. The puppets moved awkwardly. Their bodies bobbed and jerked around the stage, like the person controlling them had only recently learned how to operate the strings. I could tell the production quality was terrible. The audio crackled frequently, and the sets looked like they had been assembled from cardboard and paper mache. I always assumed it must have aired on some tiny local access station with almost no budget. That alone made it strange, but the thing that made the show truly unsettling was a character named Mr. Hat. Mr. Hat was never actually seen on screen. He was only referenced, but whenever his name came up, the puppets reacted immediately. They would recoil, covering their heads with their cloth hands. Their voices would drop into frightened whispers. The boy would shake his head, and the girl would begin to cry. The message was always the same. His name should not be spoken. Sometimes just after the name was mentioned, something would appear at the edge of the stage. The backdrop of the show was always meant to look cheerful. There was a paper sun, soft white clouds, rolling green hills painted in thick strokes of bright color. But near the curtain line, just where the scenery ended, a shadow would sometimes stretch across the set. It was tall and narrow, and on top of it was a shape that looked unmistakably like a wide hat. At first it seemed like a coincidence, just an odd shadow from the lighting. But after enough episodes, it became clear that the shadow always appeared at the same moments. By that point, you didn't need the characters to say anything. You already knew who it was supposed to be. It was Mr. Hat. What's strange is that I never once tried to turn the television off. Looking back, I realize why. It wasn't my television. I never watched Mr. Hat at home. At my house, we watched normal things. Hey Arnold, Rugrats, Nickelodeon most of the time. My parents paid for cable, and my younger sister and I had more than enough shows to keep us occupied. The only place where we ever watched Mr. Hat was at our neighbor's house. His name was Mr. Harold. He was an older man, though I struggle to remember much about him now, beyond a few oddly specific details. A large crooked nose, thick gray eyebrows that hung low, a quiet voice that rarely rose above a murmur. For whatever reason, my parents trusted him completely. Whenever they needed a babysitter, they would walk us next door and leave us there for the evening. Mr. Harold always followed the same routine. He would greet us at the door, hand each of us a small snack, usually popcorn or granola, and guide us straight into the living room. The television would already be on. Then he would disappear into the rest of the house. Looking back now, that part feels strange. We never explored his home. We never saw any other rooms besides the living room and the bathroom down the hallway. From the moment we arrived, we were directed to the couch and left there. The television would already be playing, and it was always the same show. Mr. Hat. I don't even know if they were meant to be episodes. There was rarely a story. The puppets would wander around their small painted world, talking about simple things, sometimes singing little songs. Sometimes the puppets would stop mid-scene and stare directly into the camera. Not the cheerful, exaggerated way most children's shows do. This felt different, like they were looking through the screen instead of at it. But over time, something about the show began to change. At first, it was subtle. The puppets' clothes began to look dirtier. The bright fabrics faded and darkened with stains. Their voices sounded rougher, hoarser, as if they were tired or thirsty. Then the sets began to change. The cheerful hills disappeared. One episode stands out more clearly than the others. Instead of the bright outdoor scenery, the stage looked like a basement. The walls were dark and damp. The lighting was dim and uneven, as if it came from a single bulb, somewhere off camera. The puppets looked different too. Their fabric faces seemed paler than before. The stitched smiles that once stretched across their mouths had sagged downward into crooked frowns. They stood close together, trembling. Their voices sounded strained as they repeated the same desperate message over and over again. He had taken them. He was terrible. It was someone they were too afraid to name. They never said it directly, but I knew who they meant. Even then, I knew. Beside me on the couch, my sister, barely 3 years old at the time, sat quietly eating popcorn. She probably had no idea what she was watching. Years later, I asked her about it. She had no memory of the show at all. Not even a vague one. When I started asking other people, the responses were the same. No one had heard of it. No one remembered anything like it. Not my friends or anyone from school. No single person online. If the show had really been on public access television, then somehow, impossibly, I seemed to be the only person who had ever seen it. I started wondering if I had fabricated the whole thing in my mind. It wasn't impossible. Half-remembered images can stitch themselves together until they form something that feels real. Still, the thought of Mr. Hat kept returning, far more often than it should have. What began as a curiosity slowly hardened into something closer to obsession. I would catch myself thinking about the show late at night, replaying fragments of those episodes in my mind, trying to recall details that never quite came into focus. And every time, my thoughts circled back to the same place. Mr. Harold. I began asking my parents about him. Not just vague recollections, but specifics. What they actually knew about the man who used to watch us. The answers were thin. Mr. Harold had been in his late 60s when he babysat my sister and me. Even then, he had seemed older than that. He hadn't aged particularly well. Beyond that, there wasn't much to say. He had simply been the quiet old widower next door. In the 90s, leaving your kids with a neighbor wasn't something people thought twice about. There were reasons they trusted him. He had been married once. That counted for something. He was retired and always home during the evenings. And we never complained about going over there. We weren't exactly thrilled to see him, but we never acted afraid of him either. I asked them if they remembered what he had done before retiring. For a moment, my parents looked at each other, unsure. Then my dad suddenly snapped his fingers. He remembered. Apparently, Mr. Harold had once received some sort of local recognition, some small ceremony for his years working at the television station in town. Not on camera. Something technical. The kind of behind-the-scenes job no one really notices. That was the moment something clicked into place. I wasn't imagining things. If anyone had been capable of creating a strange puppet show, it would have been someone like that. Someone who understood how television worked, who had access to equipment and sets. Mr. Harold may very well have been the man behind Mr. Hat. Unfortunately, they had no idea where he was now. They had moved away from that neighborhood more than a decade ago, and whatever connection they had once had with him had long since faded. So I began looking into it myself. I started with property records, tracing the old address. His name appeared there, just as I remembered it. From there, I searched for it online, hoping something might surface. Information was sparse. His accomplishments have been entirely local, the kind that never made their way onto the internet. There was no Facebook profile, no archived interviews, nothing that hinted at a life beyond a few aging documents. And of course, there was no trace of the show. No clips on YouTube or obscure VHS rips buried in forgotten forums. There was nothing. But eventually I found something. A photograph attached to a short post on a community page. The image showed an elderly man sitting in a wheelchair. His mouth hung slack and saliva had gathered at the corners of his lips. A pair of nurses stood nearby, smiling for the camera. The caption mentioned St. Beth's Assisted Living. The man in the chair looked unmistakably like Mr. Harold, just much older. The post was several years old, but if he was still alive, that was likely where he would be. St. Beth stood on the crest of a wooded hill just outside town. The building was large and severe, its dark stone walls rising above the trees like something from another century. When I arrived, the sky was overcast, the clouds low and heavy. The entire place looked as though it had been lifted straight out of a Mary Shelley novel. I felt anxious as I walked toward the entrance, far more anxious than the situation really justified. I've always been someone who prefers telling the truth, and I knew that to see Mr. Harold, I would probably have to tell at least one small lie. Inside, the building felt oddly grand, almost like an asylum built for wealthy patients 100 years ago. Tall ceilings and polished wood, long echoing corridors. It still smelled faintly of urine. At the front desk, a woman asked who I had come to visit. When I mentioned Mr. Harold's name, her expression shifted into one of quiet confusion. The look alone suggested that I was likely the first person to ask for him in years. For a moment, I expected her to deliver the obvious conclusion, that he had died. Instead, she asked what my relation to him was. I told her he was my great-uncle. She accepted that without question. A few minutes later, she led me down a quiet hallway, toward a lounge near the back of the building. The room was nearly empty. 2 elderly men sat near the fireplace playing chess in silence. Mr. Harold's wheelchair sat facing 2 tall windows. He faced outward at a vast stretch of forest that rolled away into the distance. Dark thunderheads were gathering along the horizon. I knelt beside him. The nurse quietly left us alone. Up close, he looked impossibly old. Late 80s at the very least, maybe even 90. His body had withered into the chair, and his face barely seemed capable of movement. The signs of late-stage Parkinson's were unmistakable. He wheezed softly as he stared out the window. Tears had pooled in the corners of his eyes. They looked permanent, as if they had simply settled there long ago and never left. I said his name. There was no reaction. After a moment, I told him why I was there. I mentioned the show, the puppets, Mr. Hat. His eyes shifted. That was the only movement his face seemed capable of. The rest of it remained still, like a mask with 2 small openings to peer out of. I asked him if he had created it, if it had been his show. He slowly closed his eyes. I couldn't tell whether that meant yes or no. It was obvious that even if he wanted to answer, speaking would be nearly impossible. Then his mouth began to move. A faint, strained sound escaped him. It looked like the most difficult task his body had attempted in years. I leaned closer. The words came slowly, wheezing past his swollen tongue. "He's still here." My heart lurched. Then his eyes closed again. The moment was over. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how unsteady my legs felt. For a few seconds, I simply stood there, unsure of what to do. Eventually, I turned to leave. Before stepping out of the room, I glanced back one final time. The storm had drawn closer, and the light coming through the windows had dimmed into a dull gray glow. It washed over Mr. Harold's frail figure and stretched a long shadow behind him. The shape of it caught my attention. Something about the curtains, the tall window frame, the angle of the light. For just a moment, the shadow behind him looked strangely familiar, almost like a figure standing on a stage. We sat in the classroom as they wheeled in the television cart. The moment that metal stand came rattling through the door, half the class perked up. The other half did what we always did when the lights dimmed and the television appeared. I started fluffing up my hoodie on the desk, bunching it into something that vaguely resembled a pillow. Usually a movie during class meant one thing: a well-deserved nap. Our chemistry teacher wasn't exactly known for riveting lectures. And if the lights were going down and a VHS tape was coming out, it meant 45 minutes of blessed silence. But then, a police officer walked in behind the cart. That immediately ruled out Bill Nye the Science Guy. Instead, it meant we were about to sit through a D.A.R.E video. For anyone reading this who wasn't in school during the 90s or early 2000s, D.A.R.E was basically a long-winded campaign to tell kids not to do drugs. Officers would show up at schools, hand out pamphlets, play educational videos, and try to convince a room full of teenagers that marijuana was a gateway to immediate ruin. Even the kids who didn't smoke pot thought it was corny. The officer stood at the front of the room wearing dark sunglasses, arms folded across his chest. He looked less like a real cop and more like someone pretending to be one. The kind of guy who seemed a little too eager to look intimidating. He didn't say much. He just stood there, scanning the classroom like he was waiting for someone to slip up. The message was clear enough. This wasn't going to be a period for sleeping. Our chemistry teacher slid the tape into the VCR with a dull plastic click. The television hummed softly as the screen flickered to life, the image rolling for a second before stabilizing. And just like that, the video began. I remember the video. Most of my classmates probably do as well. But not because it was life-changing or taught us some profound lesson. It started out unintentionally hilarious. Before YouTube and the entire culture of cringe humor, D.A.R.E videos were about the closest thing we had to awkward, unaware comedy. Everything about them felt slightly off. The dialogue, the acting, the situations. It all felt like drug deals and criminal activity written by people who had never actually witnessed any of it, or even heard a believable secondhand story. Every time someone in the classroom laughed, the police officer would clear his throat loudly and intentionally. He would shift his weight, adjust the sunglasses sitting on the bridge of his nose, and stare out over the room as if daring someone to laugh again. The video itself started the way all of them did. Upbeat rock music played while quick shots of teenagers flashed across the screen. A group of kids playing basketball in a sunny park. The main character's name was Troy. The narrator made sure we knew that Troy was 14 years old and had a bright future ahead of him. Apparently, he was already well on his way to becoming a professional basketball player if he kept working hard. At some point, Troy began walking home from school. As he approached a bus stop, a shady-looking teenager stepped out from a nearby alley. The guy leaned against the brick wall, wearing a dark hoodie and the sort of expression that movies use when they want you to know someone is a criminal. He asked Troy if he wanted to buy drugs. I remember thinking at the time that the line sounded so unnatural, it was almost impressive. At that point, the video paused. Troy's confused expression froze on the screen. Our teacher turned to the class and asked what we thought Troy should do. Hands went up. People suggested he should walk away, call the police, tell an adult. Eventually, the tape resumed, and it went on like that for a while. But after a certain point, something about the video started to feel strange. For one thing, it seemed unusually long. By the time the bell for the next period was getting close, the story was still going. Troy eventually gave in to temptation. The narrator described it as the beginning of his downfall. What followed was a bizarre spiral through every possible drug cliché the writers could imagine. He argued violently with his parents. He began skipping school. Soon, he was wandering the streets looking for drugs, his life unraveling in increasingly dramatic ways. At one point, he somehow ended up inside what the video described as a crack house. I remember wondering how a 14-year-old basketball prodigy had managed to reach that point in what felt like a span of a single afternoon. But the strangest part wasn't the plot. It was Troy himself. With each new scene, something about him looked worse. At first it was subtle. Dark circles beneath his eyes, a sheen of sweat across his face, his posture sagging more and more. Then the changes became harder to ignore. Lesions began appearing on his skin, small at first, then spreading across his arms and neck. His complexion turned pale and clammy. The healthy teenager from the beginning of the video slowly fading into something sickly and hollow. The camera moved in closer with each shot. Dutch angles tilted the frame at sharper and sharper degrees. The footage shifted to a handheld style, jittery and unsteady. It was like an art video. His face grew thinner. His eyes sank deeper into their sockets. By the time the final scenes played, he looked almost skeletal. The room had gone quiet by then. No one was laughing anymore. What had started out as a corny anti-drug film had slowly transformed into something closer to body horror. When the tape finally ended, the television screen faded to blue. The officer stepped forward and asked if anyone had any questions. No one said a word. The video itself was strange, but things became stranger a few days later. I was walking home from school when I saw Troy, or rather, the actor who played Troy in the video. He was standing outside a small coffee shop near the corner of Main Street. At first, I noticed the coughing. Loud, wet coughs that bent him forward at the waist. People leaving the cafe stepped around him, as if he were just a part of the sidewalk. It took a moment for the recognition to click, but once it did, it felt impossible to miss. It had only been a few days since we watched the tape in class. The actor was wearing the same wardrobe from the video, the same cheap basketball jersey, the same worn sneakers. His skin had the same sickly makeup on it too. Pale, clammy, dotted with those dark lesions that had slowly appeared on him throughout the story. For a second I just stood there, staring. I couldn't believe how far the school and the local police department would go to scare kids away from drugs. The whole thing had seemed ridiculous enough on tape, but now here he was, apparently continuing the performance in real life. He just stood there, waiting for the next person to come out. I headed home. At the time, I didn't think much of it, until I started seeing Troy more often. It wasn't always outside the coffee shop. Sometimes he was at the basketball court, sometimes the laundromat, the grocery store, even outside the Blockbuster. Each time he showed up, he looked worse than the last. Every time I saw him, his skin seemed more grotesque, his eyes more hollow. The lesions spread across his arms and neck, his face growing thinner with every passing week. He looked like someone slowly decaying in real time, skeletal, emaciated, his clothes hanging loosely from his frame. At first, I assumed it was still part of some elaborate scare tactic, but after a while, I wasn't so sure. For one thing, it went on for months. Another, it wasn't makeup. I realized that the day I nearly bumped into him. He asked if I had money for a bus ticket. When he spoke, the smell hit me immediately. Something foul and rotten, like dead animals left out in the sun. Up close, the sores on his skin looked real. Too real. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I started asking around to see if anyone else had noticed him walking downtown. My friend Jake said he had no idea what I was talking about. But the very next day, I saw something that made even less sense. Behind the school, near the dumpsters, Jake and a few other friends were standing with Troy. They were laughing, talking casually, like they'd known him for years. I watched Jake pull a wad of cash out and hand it to him. Troy gave him a brown bag in return. I didn't need to guess what was inside. I walked over and asked what they were doing. Jake brushed me off immediately, saying it was nothing. They were just talking. The others avoided looking at me. I thought about the video we'd watched in class, the lessons about saying no, about telling the police, about avoiding people exactly like this. I wasn't about to do all that. This wasn't a movie, and weed doesn't kill. But Troy, whatever his real name was, made my skin crawl. He looked like something out of a horror film, yet my friends were talking to him, like he was just another guy hanging around town. I couldn't tell if they genuinely didn't see what I was seeing, or if I was somehow the one overreacting. After that, I started noticing him less. The last time I saw Troy, he was walking slowly down the street ahead of me. His body had wasted away so much that I could see the outline of every bone beneath his skin. His arms and neck were covered in sores. His movement looked stiff, unnatural, like every step took more effort than the last. I crossed the street before he reached me. The image of him stayed with me long after that, and then he was gone. Troy never appeared around town again. As far as I know, he simply disappeared. If I'm being honest, I assumed he was dead. The last time I saw him, he looked like a reanimated corpse, already halfway in the grave. I know this probably makes me sound like a horrible person, but the truth is, I was relieved when he stopped showing up. The whole situation had made me deeply uncomfortable. I couldn't stop thinking about how strange it all was. I had been so certain he was the actor from the D.A.R.E video, or maybe just someone who looked almost identical. Either way, he never appeared again. But my friend Jake wasn't the same after that. We stopped hanging out sometime during junior year. He began skipping school more often, drifting toward a different crowd. The last time I saw him, he looked pale, thinner than before, and I noticed something on his neck. Small sores. He had such a promising future. There was an emergency broadcast that played on television when I was a kid. To this day, I still don't understand what it was. The first time it happened, I was watching cartoons on the couch. We were latchkey kids. My parents were both working that weekend, and I was sitting cross-legged on the carpet, staring up at the box television in the living room. I remember the room being dim, the curtains half drawn, the only real light coming from the bluish glow of the CRT screen. Old televisions filled a room with that kind of light. It flickered across the walls and furniture, making everything else in the house feel darker by comparison. My bowl of cereal sat on the coffee table beside me, slowly going soggy while the cartoon character shouted and bounced around the screen. Saturday mornings were predictable back then. Loud theme songs, exaggerated sound effects, characters crashing into walls or falling off cliffs every few seconds. It was the sort of background noise that filled the house, even when the volume was low. I had settled into that routine, barely paying attention to the show anymore, when the television suddenly went black. At first, I assumed the channel had just cut to commercial. That happened all the time. I remember lifting my spoon and taking another bite of cereal while I waited for whatever advertisement would follow. But instead of commercials, there was a sound. A long, flat tone burst from the television speakers, loud enough that it made me flinch and look up immediately. It was the kind of sound that demanded your attention, whether you wanted to give it or not. A sharp electronic hum that filled the entire room and made the quiet house suddenly feel much larger and emptier than it had a moment before. For a few seconds, the screen stayed black while the tone continued. The television sitting there in the middle of the living room, like it had taken control of the entire house. Then the picture changed. The bright colors of the cartoon disappeared and were replaced by a solid blue screen filled with white block lettering. The text was perfectly centered, the kind of stiff government font that looked like it had been typed out on an old computer and copied directly to the broadcast feed. Across the top of the screen were the words, "Emergency Broadcast System." Below that sat several lines of smaller text that I didn't understand at the time. Something about a message from the civil authorities. The name of our county appeared in the middle of the screen, along with a few others. Everything about it looked official, but something about it also felt wrong. Then the picture changed again. A man appeared on the screen. He had a sort of gentle, familiar presence that immediately reminded me of someone like Mr. Rogers. He sat facing the camera in what looked like a plain studio room, dressed neatly, his hands folded in his lap as he looked calmly into the lens. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, not whispering exactly, but soft, the way someone might talk if they didn't want to startle a child. He said things were going to change, but that everything was going to be okay. He explained that sometimes people get scared when they see something new or unexpected, and that was perfectly normal. We all get frightened sometimes. That didn't mean anything bad was happening. I remember looking over toward my brother. We were both young, and neither of us had ever seen anything like this before. He had the remote in his hand and was pressing the channel buttons, expecting the television to switch back to something normal. Instead, the screen stayed the same. The man kept talking. The man on the television paused for a moment and then said it was very important that we listen carefully. After that, my brother slowly set the remote back down on the coffee table, and we kept watching. The man said that he would be checking in again soon, and that it was very important this stayed between us. He spoke personally, as if we were having a direct conversation, not like this was being broadcast to the whole county, or even the whole country. He said we weren't to speak of this to anyone else. This was a test, and it was very important that we followed the rules. The television suddenly flickered back to our regular programming. The cartoon had continued without us, and we had apparently missed a large portion of the episode. My brother and I didn't speak. We just stared at each other for a moment. That night, when my parents got home, I thought about telling them about the broadcast. Would they even believe me? It didn't matter, I figured. Even though the man had been clear about the rules, what loyalty did I have to some stranger on a television screen? Still, something stopped me. The words were there, sitting in the back of my throat, but they never made it out. I held out hope that my brother might say something instead. He was older, and therefore it felt like he should be the one responsible to bring it up. I kept glancing across the kitchen table while we were eating dinner. It's like he was dealing with the same blockage I was. I couldn't tell if it was fear or something deeper than that. Whatever it was, neither of us could seem to say anything beyond simple responses. Thank you. Good. Nothing. Short answers to our parents' usual line of questioning. The next day was ordinary. The day after that as well. We went nearly an entire week without anything happening, and slowly, we started to forget about the whole thing. It was late one night, after my parents had gone to bed, that I heard the television turn on downstairs. I sat up immediately and noticed that my brother was already awake, sitting upright in his bed, almost as if he had been waiting. Without saying a word, we both got up and made our way downstairs, carefully navigating steps to avoid the ones that creaked, like two kids sneaking around the house on Christmas Eve, hoping to catch a glimpse of Santa. The television was on, filling the room with a faint hissing sound of static. Then the screen turned blue again, casting a pale light across the darkness of the living room. It filled the room in a strange way, almost like being underwater, the glow stretching across the walls and ceiling, while everything else sank into shadow. The man appeared once more, sitting exactly as he had before. He repeated many of the talking points he had made during the first broadcast, that things were going to change soon, that everyone gets scared sometimes. But this time, before the message ended, he added something new. He explained that tonight had only been the beginning of the test. Up until now, all we had needed to do was listen, which he said was the easy part. Children were naturally good listeners. The next part, however, would require attention. Over the next few days, he said, we might begin noticing small things that adults wouldn't. Nothing dangerous. Nothing we should be afraid of. Just small details that might feel wrong. Adults, he explained, often move through their days without really seeing what was around them. They rush from place to place, worried about work, about schedules, about things that made them overlook what was right in front of them. Children, he said, were much better at paying attention. If we noticed something unusual, he told us we were not supposed to ask our parents about it. Adults would try to explain it away. They always did. Instead, we were supposed to remember. The man paused then, leaning slightly closer to the camera, as if he wanted to make sure we understood. Some children, he said, had already failed the test. Those were the ones who had tried to tell someone. The ones who had turned the television off. The ones who had woken their parents. But that was all right, he said calmly. The test was not meant for everyone. He smiled then, the same calm, reassuring expression he had worn the entire time, and told us we were doing very well. He had told us it would just be a few days more. The screen flickered once, then the broadcast ended again, the image collapsing back into static. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The room was quiet, except for the faint hiss of the television. Finally, my brother spoke, asking something I hadn't even thought about. He asked how the man knew we had listened. For a while, nothing happened. Life simply returned to normal. School, dinner, homework. My brother and I stopped talking about the broadcast altogether, though every now and then, I could catch him sitting in the living room, staring at the television when it was turned off, like he was waiting for it to come on again. It was 4 days later, during school. I remember the moment clearly because it was so ordinary. We were sitting in math class while the teacher wrote equations across the chalkboard. The classroom windows looked out over the parking lot and the small road that ran past the school. At some point, the teacher simply stopped writing. Not abruptly, he just stopped. He stood there for a moment with the chalk still in his hand, before turning slowly to look out the window. All of the students in the classroom followed his gaze. Outside, the road had gone completely still. Cars sat in the street with their engines running. A man stood halfway across the crosswalk. A woman beside a parked car had her door open, but no one was moving. It was like someone had paused the entire scene. The moment lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then everything started again. Cars began rolling forward. The man finished crossing the street. The woman got into her car. Our teacher blinked once, then turned back toward the class and asked why everyone had stopped paying attention. The lesson continued as if nothing happened. Later that day, I tried asking a few people about it. No one knew what I was talking about. Not the teacher. Not the other kids. No one. Except my brother. When I got home that afternoon, he was sitting in the living room, watching the black screen on the television. I asked him if he had seen what happened outside the school. He nodded. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. He said that was the moment the man on the television had told us about, the moment we were supposed to watch. I asked him what it meant. He didn't answer right away. He just kept staring at the blank screen, before finally saying he thought the test was over. I asked how he knew. He said because the TV hadn't turned back on again. And it never did. It all started in 1980. I was working for the local access television station. They were looking for a new show to fill an empty programming slot. Around that time, the Muppets were peaking. Kermit the Frog was practically a household name. Obviously, I didn't want to create anything derivative. I wanted something that felt original. But the one element I thought might help draw viewers was puppets. The budget was minuscule. I had to put in a fair amount of my own money just to get the thing off the ground. Fabric and foam, paint and cameras, none of it was cheap. So I started working out of my garage, crafting characters that might appear in my little show. It wasn't much of a workspace, just an old wooden bench against the back wall, and a single overhead bulb that flickered whenever the wind kicked up outside. The place always smelled faintly of sawdust and glue. I kept boxes stacked along the walls filled with whatever supplies I could afford at the time. Scraps of felt and foam blocks, loose buttons, yarn, bits of wire. Anything that might someday become part of a character. Most evenings I'd work well past midnight. Puppet building, I learned quickly, is mostly trial and error. You cut foam into shapes, glue it together, then carve it down again when it doesn't look quite right. A face might take an entire evening to look some semblance of correct, and even then the mouth might not move properly, or the eyes might sit crooked. Still, slowly the characters began to take shape. Bright colors with big round eyes, wide smiles that could be seen clearly through a fuzzy television signal. Children respond to faces first, so I tried to make each one distinct. By the end of a few weeks, I had several of them sitting on the workbench in a row, propped up against the wall like a small audience watching me work. Sometimes I'd glance over at them while I was carving foam and catch myself thinking they looked almost alive under the single yellow bulb. It was around this time that I started experimenting with the character who would eventually become the antagonist. At first, he was nothing more than a rough head I'd pierced together from leftover materials. Dark felt and a longer face, a mouth that opened just a bit wider than the others. And of course, the hat. I remember placing it on the puppet's head almost as a joke, but once it was there, it didn't look right without it. So I left it. When I brought the props, sets, and unstrung puppets into the station, I was surprised at the, backlash I received. Apparently the network didn't share the same enthusiasm I had. I wasn't expecting applause. No one needed to clap me on the shoulder or praise the work, but the reaction I received was something closer to discomfort, even disgust. One of the cameramen muttered something about them sitting somewhere in the uncanny valley. I suppose that was fair. They weren't polished like the puppets you'd see on national television, but I thought there was a certain charm to them. My wife certainly thought so. Back then, she would sit with me in the garage while I worked. She'd sew the little shirts and dresses, while I carved the foam heads. Sometimes she'd laugh at the faces I made when a puppet turned out crooked. She always said children didn't care about perfection. They just cared about something that felt alive. That word again. Alive. The puppet that seemed to draw the most attention, both fascination and hatred, was Mr. Hat. Oddly enough, he was the one who felt most alive. At the mere sight of him, my coworkers stepped back, as if something about him was wrong. One woman refused to even touch the puppet when I offered it to her. "What is that supposed to be?" she asked. I remember feeling embarrassed. What were they seeing that I was not? Naturally, the station refused to create a show, using what I heard them refer to more than once as those little monstrosities. I truly believed they simply couldn't see the vision, so I spent more of my savings. A home camcorder, cheap lights, microphones that barely worked. I even found a thrifted book on the art of puppetry. If the station wouldn't produce my story, then I would. I would build it myself. A one-man show. Once they saw what I had created, surely they'd understand. Surely they'd want to air it. All the while, I worked diligently at the studio, doing everything I could to stay in their good graces. I volunteered for extra shifts, handled equipment no one else wanted to deal with. Eventually, I even received small awards for my contributions. But I never quite moved up the ladder. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if they were humoring me. I think somewhere deep down, whenever they saw me, they were thinking about Mr. Hat. Over time, I became something of an oddity at the studio. People kept their distance. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. A social pariah, you might say. Still, my work was recognized. I told myself that had to count for something. Back at home, I worked day and night in the unfinished basement. Whenever I wasn't at the station, I was down there building the show. My wife would come down sometimes. In the beginning, she was encouraging. But over the years, she stopped staying very long. She said the puppets were beginning to look different. I didn't see it myself. To me, they just felt unfinished. I kept adjusting them, carving the foam a little more, repainting the eyes. Perfection takes time. Though, I will admit, eventually the changes started to make them stranger rather than better. The puppet that became strangest of all was Mr. Hat. The revulsion he faced at the studio gave me an idea. He should simply serve as the antagonist of the show. Even I had to admit, while Mr. Hat felt the most alive, that might unsettle children. He simply wasn't ready for the screen. But I couldn't remove him from the story. After all, he was the story. So when I began filming test footage, learning how to move the puppets without tangling their strings, Mr. Hat would simply sit on the workbench in the corner. He wouldn't appear on camera. Not yet. At first, the problem was the strings. I could never keep them straight. But after a while, something else began happening. My hands started shaking. Not a little trembling. No, uncontrollably. Sweat would run down my neck as though I were standing in front of a live audience. The room would grow unbearably quiet. All the while, Mr. Hat sat there on the bench, staring, judging me. Now I understand how this sounds, but Mr. Hat's face began changing. Not dramatically, nothing so obvious, but every morning when I entered the basement, something about him felt slightly different. His mouth would be pulled wider, the eyes set deeper. They were subtle things that only someone who had built the puppet himself would notice. Each day, I found myself placing him a little closer to the stage curtain. I told myself it was simply convenience, a better place to store him between recordings. But over time, he began appearing nearer and nearer to the stage, casting a shadow. I even started improvising lines in my scripts. Warnings, really. My other puppets would tell the children that if Mr. Hat ever appeared, they should avoid him. They shouldn't listen to what he had to say, because Mr. Hat wanted to spread a message. I don't know what that message was, but I knew it wasn't good. By 1992, I had been working on the show for over a decade. Television had changed a great deal in that time. New technology, new programming, things I struggled to understand with age. The younger people at the station were talking about something called the internet, but none of that mattered to me. I had my show, over 50 hours of footage. I brought the tapes into the station and sat down with my boss. I inserted the first cassette and waited for his reaction. Surely after all of these years of work, something would come from it. But after only a few minutes, he stopped the tape. He simply shook his head. He wouldn't watch the rest. I tried to explain that the episodes improved as they went on, that I had gotten better with practice, that my hands didn't shake as much anymore, though that part may have been a lie. But he wasn't interested. It was the worst day of my life. Mr. Hat, my show that I had devoted a decade to, was rejected. I couldn't handle it. I lost my temper. They didn't fire me, but they did force me into retirement soon after. It was around that time anyway, but it felt less like retirement and more like exile. I spent my whole life believing in the American dream, that if you worked hard enough, eventually something good would come of it. But I'd simply run out of time. After that, I was alone in the house. My wife had passed suddenly several years before. By the end of things, she barely recognized the man I had become. I had been so consumed by the show that I hardly noticed our marriage slipping away. Now the house was quiet. My only companions were the puppets. Most of them offered comfort, but one of them blamed me. Mr. Hat blamed me for everything. For my incompetence, my lack of craftsmanship, for failing to bring the show into the world. He hated me for it. I tried to pack everything away, to put the puppets in boxes and forget about them, to start a new chapter. But I knew Mr. Hat had other plans. His show would be seen, one way or another.